Hi. I'm chronically lonely. Maybe not like incel levels of lonely, but misunderstood main character of a YA novel lonely. And when I'm feeling lonely, I gravitate towards art that expresses the same feeling that I have. The past few months, that has looked like me sitting on this couch attempting to not make Norman Reedus fall over in Death Stranding, as well as listening to bad early 2000s Midwest emo music, and looking at one artist in particular quite a lot, and that's the late American painter Andrew Wyeth. Truthfully, I never gave Andrew Wyeth's work much thought until the last year, and I want to share why I gained such an interest in his work and how I found solace in his paintings. In order to do that, I need to wax pathetic about my move back to Maine right before the pandemic, after essentially having run away for over a decade. Of course I had to make this video about me because I'm a millennial, and my parents never told me that they loved me. Does it show? It's also something that I've just been thinking about since I've been locked in this house for over a year. So before we talk about Andrew Wyeth, we first need to talk about this great pine tree state and all of its peculiarity. Maine is the innocuous and often forgotten northeastern tip of the United States, and probably a place most Americans couldn't point to on a map, and I wouldn't blame them. We don't have a lot of things or stuff. We don't have a city of over 100,000 residents. 90% of the state is covered in forests, and Maine is the only US state to border just one other state. So there's only one way in and one way out. Most people's idea of what Maine is like comes from the context of the most iconic American horror novels and subsequently movie adaptations by Stephen King. And I'm not gonna lie, some of it's kind of accurate. I spent many weekends of my childhood in the town that The Mist takes place in, and Pet Sematary looks like it could have been set outside of my home. Our family literally has a pet cemetery where we have buried my childhood pets and farm animals. But to my knowledge, there is no knife-wielding toddlers or racism. But there was a cult that existed in the forest behind my childhood house, and they would sometimes have ceremonies at night and play loud drums to summon the alien god that they worshipped. That is real. That is a real thing. Without Maine's remoteness and its geographic isolation, Stephen King's horror either wouldn't be the same or wouldn't exist at all. But before Stephen King's nightmares invaded the American psyche, one of the only other familiarities people had with what Maine was like was through the settings of Andrew Wyeth's paintings. Hi, sweetie. Am I gonna resurrect you from the dead, and are you gonna murder me? Yes or no? Is that a yes? But who was Andrew Wyeth, you might ask? Andrew Wyeth was an American painter with an extremely successful and prolific career through the mid and late 20th century. Born in 1917, he was the son of an also famous illustrator, N.C. Wyeth. His artwork clearly had an influence, but had a much different vibe, as the kids say. As a child, Andrew Wyeth was sickly. He had to be homeschooled actually because of his health issues, but this allowed him to be trained under his father in art. His siblings also went on to become painters, but unfortunately I don't like them quite as much. I wish I did. Throughout his childhood, his family split their time between his hometown of Chadsford, Pennsylvania, as well as the Rockland area of Maine. Rockland is a quiet, small seaside town halfway up the coast of Maine with just lobstermen and, local townsfolk. Coincidentally, this is where my grandparents lived for a few decades, and it's actually where my mother grew up, all during the same time that Andrew Wyeth was creating paintings of the surrounding area. Folks from other parts of the country, or God forbid, even outside the US, might not know that for northeastern dwellers, Maine is a very, very popular spot to travel to during the summer months. Because the climate here is cooler, we have thousands of lakes, we have a beautiful coastline. So it doesn't surprise me that the Wyeth family spent a lot of time here as well, especially considering NC Wyeth's proclivity to very beautiful landscapes. The mid-coast area, as we refer to it here in Maine, would remain a constant source of inspiration for Andrew as his career blossomed and he sort of developed his own style away from his father's. He would become known for the ability to capture the cold, muted tones of the rocky earth and the desolate, wind-lapped ocean fronts. However, his early paintings of these scenes use much less nuanced color, much less detail, and honestly, I don't find them that interesting. They are close to occupying part of the genre that I call lighthouse paintings. A dramatic shift away from these lighthouse paintings into what he would become known for started to develop in his early 20s after an extremely tragic life event. In October of 1945, in Pennsylvania, N.C. Wyeth, his father, was driving over a set of train tracks with his grandson when his car stalled and he was hit by an oncoming train, killing both of them. This horrific tragedy drastically changed Andrew's outlook on life, as it would with anybody. I would feel like a monster if I said Andrew's paintings became better as a result of the death of his father, but there is a noticeable shift stylistically and in content after this tragic event. And I'm not trying to romanticize tragedy or mental illness among artists because I think that is really reckless, but there is an undeniable change. And his work became much more lonely and introspective, and that's something that personally resonates more with me than beautiful landscapes. Not to say that they're necessarily better, but they are different, and I gravitate towards it. And you might think looking at this change through the lens of loss and pain and loneliness could be contrived because we're just talking about mostly like paintings of landscapes and houses. But the slowness in which he painted, because of the painstaking observation and the search for permanence through the act of remembering the landscape or the homes of loved ones or the faces of his friends with an incredible amount of detail, feels so connected to processing grief. Death reminds you that nothing is permanent, and that fact is terrifying. Making art gives humans the illusion that they can control the passing of time, since it preserves one specific moment forever. And in 1948, just 3 years after his father's death, he would paint one of his most remarkable pieces and one of the most iconic American paintings of the 20th century, Christina's World. Christina's World is an egg tempera painting done in Cushing, Maine, just outside of Rockland, of Anna Christina Olson, depicting her as a young woman laying in a vast field with her back turned to the viewer as she appears to almost be reaching out towards a house sitting far away on top of a hill. I found out through research after writing some of this description of Christina's World that Christina Olson had a degenerative muscle disorder and she had very limited mobility in her legs. but she refused to use a wheelchair. So she would drag herself by her hands in and around her home. The tension between her and her home in the painting is palpable and has captured the imagination of the public for almost 75 years. Because it almost just seems like she is trapped within this painting. The seemingly endless fields that she lays in serves the narrative of loneliness. It's just her and her house in an empty bed of grass. And this is all that makes up her entire world. Everything in this scene screams coastal Maine to me, even if I can't quite put my finger on it. All the way down to the grayness of the sky, the individual strands of grass, and the style of window panes on the house. I feel like I've been there before, or that this could be my own backyard. But beyond physical characteristics, it also just exudes the feeling that Maine has to me. That it's endless, cold, empty, and I am being sucked back into the same landscape that makes up Christina's entire world. And there's only me and my house. And I couldn't have known when I moved back here right before the pandemic how real that feeling would become. Every year, Andrew Wyeth would return to the Rockland area and immerse himself amongst the landscape to paint, spending hours every day alone with a paintbrush in hand. When he wasn't outdoors creating landscapes, he would do portraits of Christina. They would spend days together while she sat for Andrew's paintings, often in or around her home. Many of his other paintings of Christina he created over the decades feature similar themes of loneliness, escapism, and isolation. However, the last painting he did about Christina doesn't have Christina in it at all. In 1969, he created his watercolor, End of Olsons. And while it may seem like just a simple painting of a house in front of the ocean, I think it is one of his most poetic and deeply emotional paintings that he ever created. For this piece, Andrew Wyeth returned to the same house that is featured in the background of Christina's world to paint it one last time. The piece was completed soon after Christina and her brother, who lived in the house, passed away just a week from one another, and the house was left abandoned. What was left of the home and the memory of his lifelong friends was a crumbling chimney and battered shingles amongst the bare and muted fall trees. The ocean included in the background serves as a reminder that after what we have built has been forgotten and is decaying, the ocean will continue to rise and fall with the tide without us. The only life found in this piece amongst the cold landscape are a pair of swallows, one already in flight, departing for the winter, while the other remains perched on the roof. After he completed this painting, Andrew Wyeth would never return to the house, since it no longer held meaning after the ones he cared about had left it. So why do these cold, lonely, washed out landscapes resonate with me so much? Andrew didn't feel trapped or isolated here like I did, but I do think the isolation and emptiness of Maine were physical representations, if not sometimes direct metaphors, for his own pain that he experienced. And it's funny because he actively chose to be alone in the landscape and paint it, and I did everything I could to escape it. I grew up nestled in the forest here on a farm with very few friends, and that only became more so when I was socially ostracized throughout my teens for being queer, and I blamed that on Maine. I blamed that on living in such a remote place. And I felt like if I were just able to escape, then those problems would go away. While I felt that because of this place, Andrew Wyeth felt pain and brought it to this place. And that's the overlap that I see, and I think why his work resonates with me so much. The surrounding forest, the endless stretches of road, and the wrapping ocean all became real physical barriers to community and to my happiness. They created boundaries for my escape. When I finally did leave Maine at 18, I spent 6 years in New Hampshire, 3 years in Massachusetts, and a collective year's worth of time in 2 different parts of Canada. I moved so frequently and picked up my life every time I felt restless because I was afraid that if I stayed somewhere too long, that loneliness would catch up to me. But if I just kept moving around, then I could outrun it. But then in December of 2019, me and my husband purchased a dilapidated house off of a strange man on Craigslist, which is definitely normal. At the time, we were living in Boston and barely affording rent for our horrible 400 square foot attic apartment. It just so happened that the house that we purchased was a mile away from my entire family and where I grew up. I probably have around 50 to 100, maybe more, relatives within a mile radius. So the fact that this house just happened to be on the perimeter of all of that was really bizarre and terrifying, to say the least. I used to bike past my now house when I would go to the country store as a child. When we bought it, there was no walls, there was no floor. The only evidence that somebody had ever lived there were magazines that were nailed to the wall as makeshift insulation from the 1950s. It was cold and empty and kind of creepy, but the gravity of this place just drew me back in. My family has never left this area in 9 generations since 1762. So it almost felt like a curse that I was going to be back here and I would continue this weird family tradition. And after months of rebuilding, we moved in 1 week before COVID lockdown, the beginning of 2020. And I found myself literally trapped in the place that I spent many years wishing to escape. The same fields, the same roads, they surrounded me once again. And even though I knew I wasn't alone this time, it was hard to shake that childhood loneliness. So here I've been, in my own formerly dilapidated home, in a state I never thought I would live in again. Spending a lot of time with Andrew's work over the last year has helped me come to terms with living here again and knowing that somebody could make such impactful and important art in and about this place gives me hope that I could maybe do a fraction of the same. But not only that, it's okay to be alone. And beauty and importance can come from solitude. And it doesn't have to purely be a negative thing. The Olson house is now a National Historic Landmark and is being renovated along with Andrew Wyeth's studio by the museum that houses most of his work. So who knows? Maybe once the winds of the ocean have swept me away, somebody will bother to restore this house. Probably not, but one can hope. If you liked this video, please let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more video essays like this one. It also helps me be graced by the algorithm gods. And I want to say thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. I objectively love you more. If you'd like to support me and the channel, and you enjoy exclusive videos and art guides and sneak previews, go over to my Patreon. And if you don't, you're transphobic. So until next time, do an art. Oh, my big Italian man. Oh, yes. Look at this. Look at this. Beautiful. Beautiful.